When you're actually in the psilocybin session, it's simply lying down where you feel comfortable, and the patient will have an eye mask on for the whole experience because it's a very inward experience. It's very personal.
Do you have music on?
Yeah.
Can I go in there? Welcome back to another episode of Self-Dom Beautiful Humans, a safe place to learn and get inspired to live your healthiest and most fulfilling life. I am Dom, your host, and I feel so grateful to be living my passion by getting to interview inspiring and knowledgeable guests. Today's episode is one that I have wanted to create since January, when Mum was told there was no more treatment and my family and I had to deep dive into death. I know no one likes to talk about it, but I actually want to change the narrative and become more open about this topic. Grieving is the most common human experience. Everyone will have to endure it at some point. So understanding end-of-life care a little better has empowered me and really helped with the healing journey. On the podcast, I have Shanae O'Leary, a registered psychologist who has a strong passion in palliative care treatments. Shanae has done a lot of work on trauma and is currently working with a team of health professionals and palliative care specialists to make psilocybin-assisted therapy accessible to people given a terminal diagnosis who are experiencing existential distress towards the end of their life. After seeing how Mum was on those last 9 days of her life, I feel extremely passionate about this subject. So welcome to Self-Dom.
Thank you so much for having me.
So we met on Walk Club, and Shanae came into my DMs when I was going through everything with my mum, and I just felt so drawn to what she was doing, her studies, and yeah, it just feels really, really nice to have you on the mic. And yeah, today we're going to be diving deep into some topics which you might feel uncomfortable as a listener, but this is a safe space to be talking about it. So I wanted to start with you. How did you get into this whole world of psychology and into the specific subjects you're studying right now?
So my passion for psychology and becoming a psychologist has really evolved over time. I've always been interested in the brain and kind of neuroscience and really understanding why we behave and think in certain ways. But there was periods throughout my studies where I didn't really know exactly who I was, and trying to find who I was, the process that I went through, that really kind of deep understanding really made me feel quite empowered and made me feel really secure in who I was in this world, and made me, I guess, understand my place. And that's where my passion for becoming a psychologist has really kind of thrived on, where I felt like I knew who I was. I felt like other people deserve that understanding, and other people deserve the space and the time to really get to know who they are, maybe why they feel certain ways, why they might act out, why they might feel frustrated, why they might feel sad. Because a lot of people don't necessarily have that understanding. And I think it's such a privilege to have it. And I'm so grateful that I've gone through that process to get it. And don't get me wrong, figuring out who we are is an ever-long process. I feel like it changes over time. But truly feeling confident in who I am and the decisions that I've made has really, really just sparked that passion. And yeah, that's kind of what kind of got me into psychology and what's kind of continued to drive that passion. But the work with, I guess, psilocybin was really interesting, actually. Again, that was something I always found quite passionate. I was always passionate about, was something that was super interesting, but it was still such a niche field, and it's still so, so new. And it was about, I think probably a year and a half, 2 years ago now, I sent my resume off to a company called Mind Medicine Australia. They're kind of at the forefront of a lot of the research and kind of the training around psilocybin assisted therapy. Yeah, I sent my resume off to them, kind of said this is something I was passionate about, wondering if they had any kind of volunteer experience or any work experience available. And they came back and said, like, we really appreciate it. We don't have anything, but we'll keep your resume on file. And I kind of acknowledged that, didn't really expect anything more. And then a bit over a year later, a woman named Justine Topfer reached out to me. She's a death doula, and she kind of started this initiative that we've been working on. And she said, I've got your resume sent to me by Mind Medicine. I really kind of aligned with, I guess, what you kind of spoke about and your passion for psilocybin. And this is a project I'm working on. I think we could work well together. And that's kind of where it all started.
Yeah, wow. I'm so excited to dive really deep into the whole psilocybin element of what you do. Has your relationship with this woman kind of changed your view on death?
Definitely. I feel like we don't really speak about death.
No, and that's why I'm so intrigued to see how people respond to this episode, because I know before Mum went through what she went through, if I heard the term death, I would have turned this podcast off. But what I really want to achieve in this episode is to allow people to be okay with it and to learn and to listen and to know that it's the one thing that we're all going to have to deal with. So it's the one thing we should definitely be diving deeper into. So, how has your relationship with death changed?
It's so hard to put into words because I feel like it's such a profound experience and so many different things come into play when we think about death and our life. And it's not just about death. Like what I mentioned, it's about our life, the meaning that we give to it, the purpose that we have, the people that we surround ourselves with. And when we, think about what life would be like when we don't have any of those things, it's scary and uncomfortable to think about. And so it's easier not to. And like what you said, death is the one thing that is certain in life, which is terrifying because we want to feel like we have control over what we can do and what we can't do. And it's scary to think we have to let go of that control. But really, letting go of that control was a big thing. It allowed me to understand more about and be open-minded to, and that it's something that we really need to talk about because so many people like yourself have gone through such significant and so many challenging experiences with their families, and you see your family like your mum, you saw her go through so many tough things. She looked like an absolute incredible woman. She was such a survivor and she was so strong. But there were also times when it was scary and you didn't know what was going to happen.
Well, I remember when we were going through it all, I was listening to every podcast about palliative care, every podcast about voluntary assisted death, every podcast about these things that I had never wanted to listen to, but I wanted to learn more. As you said, it's something that we cannot control. And I think that's when the grieving process is harder, is when you hold on and you think, well, what if this and what if that? But you can't change anything. So I thought it'd be good to kind of define what palliative care is, because we've thrown that term around a little bit and some people might be unsure because they've never had to deal with it. What is it?
When I think traditionally we think of what palliative care is, if we've ever experienced a loved one going into palliative care, we often think of them in their final stage of their life. And it can often sometimes feel like we're almost giving up or kind of letting go and saying goodbye to someone in those last moments of their life. And that can be what palliative care is for a lot of people. But also palliative care can be something people are in for months to years before they do kind of get to those final stages of their life. It's really focused on an approach that it's focused on quality of life and giving someone the quality of life they deserve, giving them the autonomy to make decisions over their care, and also allowing family to be involved in that process. It's not just a isolated process where you have to make those decisions completely on your own. So it's not just focused on the patient itself, it's also focused on the care of them as a family and as a unit. Because as I'm sure you would experience, your mum would have gone through so much herself, but you guys as a family would have gone through so much. There's so much grief involved in that process, not just the grief from your mum of the life that she's losing, but also you grieving a mum and the future that you guys don't have together anymore, which is such a tough experience. Yeah. And so palliative care is really, really focused on giving people, giving patients, giving families that quality of life, that support that they deserve in those final moments.
So what is the criteria to be in a palliative care unit?
So in Australia, palliative care is available to anyone diagnosed with a life-limiting illness. So when we think about what a life-limiting illness is, it's unfortunately at that stage where it can't be cured, which can be really tough. And so having, these support systems around in place allows people to have that quality of life they deserve towards the end of their lives. But palliative care is not just strictly about diagnosis. It's also really based on the needs, the values, and kind of the goals of what that person, their family really want those final moments of their lives to look like. And as I mentioned, those final moments can really vary depending on the family and their circumstance. It might be in those final days or even final weeks. But for some people, depending on the progression of their illness, they might choose to have that palliative care approach years before they kind of get to those final stages. So the shift in focus goes from really curing the illness to preventing and kind of relieving suffering that a patient or family might be going through.
So this was something I really struggled with, because when you're in the palliative care unit or ward, the quality of life for the patient is so bad. Like for my mum, she was such a vibrant and powerful woman. She wanted to create impact in this world. But when she was in there, I know she would have hated us to have seen her like that. Like, I truly know that she wouldn't have wanted us to see her how we did for those last 9 days. And I guess that's where I'm curious about the use of psilocybin, but also voluntary assisted death. What are the laws around voluntary assisted death in this country?
So I think this is a surprise to a lot of people, but voluntary assisted dying is actually legal in all 6 states
Legal,
in Australia.
but you have to sign, like you have to go through a process. So when mum was as sick as she was, it wasn't an option. And I think this is where I'm so passionate about talking about death, because if you don't talk about it, then the person gets to this stage where they can't speak for themselves. So it is legal, but what is the process to allow it?
So I think the guidelines are so heavily regulated that it can sometimes be difficult for some people to access. And we think about the laws around it. Each state differs slightly, but kind of the common themes, the common principles that we see is that it is very heavily regulated. The eligibility criteria, it's quite strict. And so just having kind of a mental illness or maybe a disability that causes distress isn't enough to access voluntary assisted dying. There needs to also have that element of that life-limiting illness that might be impacting those factors as well. You've got to have 2 independent doctors to kind of make the decision and assess the patient. But also the process is voluntary and the patient has to have decision-making capacity.
So
And
that's where my mum was unable to.
And that's where it can get really murky. And again, it differs from state to state, but I know that there can be 3 kind of different ways to make that decision-making process. And one of those often has to be the patient has to write their request out, which can be really challenging in those final moments.
And that's why you need to have these conversations, because you don't wish upon anyone to ever have to go through it. But you kind of need to have the measures in place. Like even my dad and me now are writing up my will.
Wow.
And I'm 30.
What's
But
that
you need
experience
to
been like?
have it. Now going through what I've gone through with mum, you do not know what the next day is going to bring. I would rather be prepared, because you don't want it to be a contract nightmare for your family and a whole other stress that can break families apart. That's the last thing I would want. And you need to ask these really hard questions now. No one wants to believe that anything bad will ever happen to them. But what has happened to my mom has taught me that you just don't know. So now it makes sense why she couldn't do the voluntary assisted dying. That's why she couldn't do that. But when it comes to pain management, that was another big thing that we struggled with my mum. She was in excruciating pain and we were thinking, can we use cannabis? And then also psilocybin. So is psilocybin something that people use for pain?
So the research, again, is so limited in its direct effects on pain. And I don't know specifically the interactions between the current pain medications that are used in those treatments and psilocybin. But what we do know is psilocybin has shown to have an indirect effect on pain. So patients in clinical trials have reported substantial reductions in their pain. So that's the self-reported pain after undergoing psilocybin-assisted therapy. But what a lot of kind of the research behind that helps us understand is there is such a strong bidirectional relationship between our emotional states and our pain. So when we are experiencing kind of heightened emotions, we can often have amplified experiences of pain, and vice versa. If we are kind of in a lot of pain, for example, if our pain's quite amplified, we're in states where we can't focus on anything else, that can also heighten our emotional responses. We can feel more anxious, maybe more sad, or fearful, sometimes angry. And so kind of the bidirectional relationship there has shown us what the interaction with psilocybin does is, while it's not a direct treatment for pain management, but it helps with the psychological and the mental health side of things, which in turn has shown kind of reductions in some people's perceived pain.
So a lot of people are thinking, what is psilocybin? I'm thinking psilocybin is mushies.
Yeah.
But so how do you prescribe psilocybin? Because I think a lot of us would know mushy chocolate, but I'm thinking is that's not how you're giving your patients, right? How do you actually give psilocybin?
So psilocybin assisted therapy as a process. So in July 2023, it actually became an available treatment, but specifically for treatment-resistant depression. So it's still very limited in who can actually access this treatment. But essentially, as you mentioned, kind of like organic mushrooms are what people traditionally think of as psilocybin. So when people don't know, I'm like, oh, magic mushrooms. They go, oh,
Oh
yeah, I
yeah.
get it.
Yeah.
But when we think about it in kind of the therapeutic form, it's often taken in a tablet. But the process
But
is
is it still mushrooms?
no, so it's kind of the synthetic compound of
Ah.
that's within.
So do they mimic what would happen if you have magic mushrooms with a synthetic drug? Is that what it is?
So it's the process that's really different. So often when people take magic mushrooms recreationally, it might be for different purposes. Like it might be fun, having a good time, kind of going out in nature with your friends, whatever it may be. But the process when taken in kind of the therapeutic form is very, very different. So often people, I'm referring to a lot of the clinical trials that have undergone and also some of the treatment-resistant depression cases that have actually happened in Australia. There's usually a few prep sessions before actually undergoing the experience. So often that's kind of 1 to 3 sessions where you might meet your therapist, kind of go through the experience of what it actually might be like. A lot of people report kind of some transient effects within the psilocybin experience, so maybe transient anxiety, sometimes some nausea, some headaches. So it's preparing people for those symptoms so they're not caught off guard and might not feel overwhelmed if they do happen in that session. But it's also really focused on kind of the goals that the patient has. So whether they're experiencing existential distress, whether they're kind of fearful towards their death, whether they're worried that they aren't having that sense of connection with their loved ones, whether they've lost that sense of identity and really want it back so their family and friends remember them for who they actually are, not this person who's suffering from this illness. And I think that's such a big one for me, that loss of identity. And so in those prep sessions, it's almost like therapy sessions where you're kind of understanding what's going on for you, unpacking these goals and what you want the process to be like for yourself. And then the actual psilocybin session is a single session that's the whole day. Often the actual psilocybin experience goes for 6 to 8 hours.
Is it a lot of mushrooms? Like, are you giving them a lot? Because like a lot of people microdose. Like, are you going in?
So it depends. Different clinical trials and different, I guess, therapies are different. Different clinical. I think it's. I'll have to clarify this before I finish, but I think it is 25 grams per kilo of body weight. That's often the standard that's in the literature. But in this experience, when you're actually in the psilocybin session, it's simply lying down where you feel comfortable. The space is not very clinical. It's very kind of relaxing, very therapeutic. Often there's calming, relaxing music on in the background. And the patient will have an eye mask on for the whole experience because it's a very inward experience. It's very personal. You'll often have 2 therapists there, but they're just there for support. They're not there to ask you questions, like kind of
Really?
guide
Do
you
you have
through
music
anything.
on?
Yeah.
Can
And so
I go
it's
in there?
so it's such a personal experience. Often the therapists are just there if the person might be feeling distressed
Wow.
or needs extra support. Often a lot of people report that they come out from the 8-hour experience and they say they only felt like it was 30 minutes to an hour. So after the psilocybin experience, the most integral and the most important part of psilocybin-assisted therapy are the integrative sessions that people go through after. Often the experience can be, very heightened emotionally. There can be lots that happens in the experience with someone. They might have kind of visual hallucinations. They might experience really strong raw emotions. And so if they're not given the space to process those, it can be really confusing for some people and it can be a lot to kind of sit with and deal with on our own. And so those integrative sessions is where we process the trauma. We process what went on for us. We process maybe some of the fears that we had going into the experience, fears about our death, who we are, how we want to be remembered. And those sessions is where we actually see the change. When we've gone through a psilocybin experience, in kind of the sessions following, our brain is so flexible. And so when we think about neuroplasticity, there is so much more opportunity to strengthen those neural connections of what we went through. And so we can see such significant changes in such a short period of time. And so that's where there is the difference between the recreational use and the therapeutic use, is that kind of integration after the experience of
With
what you went through.
psychologists and yeah. That's amazing. So I just want to know, when you're doing these trials, who are the patients?
So currently for the clinical trials just focused on kind of palliative care, we're looking at populations of people who have been given a terminal diagnosis. It can range anywhere between 3 years to 6 months of their life expectancy that they've given. And we often, well, I guess clinical trials often need kind of that period there so that people can go through this process, because it is quite a long process. If you think of 3 sessions to prepare you, the 6 hour session, 6 to 8 hour session to go through that experience, and then maybe 3 or more after, like it can take such a long time. Often can take a couple of months to go through that whole process. So we need people to be able to actually engage in that process. Like with voluntary assisted dying, patients also have to have that decision-making capacity to make the informed decision that they want to undergo this treatment, know how long it might take, the process of it. But at the moment, because it's still in a clinical trial phase in Australia, but also internationally, they are patients who have enrolled in the studies.
Okay, amazing. So from my point of view, my mum wouldn't have been able to do it unless she had tried to do it a year in advance.
So we have submitted an application. So the team that I've been working in, we've submitted an application to the TGA to try expand the use of psilocybin to also include existential distress for people towards the end of their life. But right now, unfortunately, it's only available for people who have met that kind of criteria for treatment-resistant depression. Even then, it's not where we want it to be in terms of access. It can be a very expensive process. We're slowly starting to see changes. Like the DVA, so the Department of Veteran Affairs, have just announced that they're subsidising MDMA therapy for veterans with PTSD. So we're slowly seeing changes, but it's still such a new process. Like it was only rescheduled in 2023. So we've still got a lot of room and a lot of growth for this to be an accessible treatment option for everyone who needs it. But it's still early days, but I'm hopeful that we'll be able to kind of get more of an understanding and more of an awareness of what psilocybin therapy actually is and how beneficial it can be to so many different people.
So from my understanding, right now, because it's in these trial periods, you need people who have six months minimum of life left. But say this, in a few years or whenever it is that it becomes more regulated, I guess, it would be a therapy that, you could speak to the family about, and then they could see if you would want to do it with. Because I think the way that I see it is when you're in this state of, you're going to die, I can imagine how hard that would be on your mindset. To feel a little bit of joy and to try something, why not? Like, you don't have long on this earth. What are the real risks?
And that's a thing when we think about psilocybin therapeutically and what it actually does. I mentioned before, kind of our brain is in more of a flexible state. So when we are in that more flexible state, it helps reduce some like rigid and repetitive kind of thinking patterns that we have, something that we often see with patients with depression and anxiety. But it also really strengthens those emotional connections that we have. So we often feel more connected to ourselves, kind of the feelings and the experiences we have. That's where we see a lot of shift in that kind of change in that personal identity. But it also helps us feel more connected to the people around us, but also the world. So therapeutically, psilocybin also seems to kind of quiet down the default mode network. So that's the part of our brain that's linked to overthinking, self-criticism, and rumination. And so when that quietens down, people often feel more free, kind of less stuck and more present. And a lot of the research behind kind of meditation and breath work and what that has been able to help is quieting down that default mode network as well. So there are some connections there with kind of breath and body work and what psilocybin can actually do to the brain. And finally, one of the other therapeutic uses that I think is so important to highlight is it allows people to gain new perspectives. After psilocybin experiences, people really describe seeing themselves and seeing their life and seeing the people around them in such a different way. And so we can find ways to accept what's been going on for us. And if we think about what you mentioned before, those stages of grief, feeling like we don't have control, so trying to get that control back, almost denying what's happening, and that anger and that frustration that we can experience. We think about the different stages of grief. Acceptance is often that last stage, which is the hardest stage to get to. And it can be such a challenging point to sit back and accept what's happening. And if we think about exactly what the patient's going through, if they're really struggling to accept their death and what's going on for them, it can be so much harder for the people around to accept. And sometimes that guilt can come in when we try and accept what's going on if the person going through isn't accepting. So finding that way to accept what's happening, and in accepting that, it allows us to be more present, be more focused, be more intentional with the people around us. It also gives them permission to kind of accept and gives them permission to grieve, and also gives them a chance to just be with that person as they are, not the person who's sitting in front, maybe with a life-limiting illness. It's just like sitting with your mum. It's not sitting with someone who has a cancer diagnosis.
Would you offer this sort of treatment to, say, the partners and family members, or is it because obviously, you're talking about these positive impacts on it? I think it would actually really benefit the grieving as well as the patient.
A lot of the research, there's been a lot of research that's gone into the impacts of existential distress on patients' family members as well. But unfortunately, well, not that I'm aware of, there's no research on psilocybin for those family members. So I can't really say whether it's going to be a treatment that would be available.
It's quite hard as well with using psilocybin, because I'm sure a lot of my listeners here are thinking, well, should I go out and take some mushy chocolate on the weekend? So these studies have been specific for people with life-limiting illnesses. I just want to make that very clear. Do you have any points on that for any people who are like, well, sounds like a great drug?
I'm definitely not endorsing people going out and using mushrooms and using psilocybin. I think a lot of my experience and knowledge does come back to that therapeutic kind of perspective and that therapeutic understanding. But I think it's really important to highlight a lot of the clinical trials and a lot of the research out there have also given, I guess, patients, friends and families kind of self-report ratings, which has allowed them to almost rate changes in kind of their behavior and their attitudes and beliefs. And what the research has shown that a lot of the friends, family and people around them have seen such a shift in those changes.
So it has like a domino effect onto your family and to your friends. You were talking a little bit about breathwork and meditation before, and I know that one of the areas you focus on a lot is trauma. Has there been any studies about these mindfulness tools and their impact on trauma? Because I know we've been speaking a lot about psilocybin, but I also know that there is so much information and so many studies really highlighting how incredible meditation and breathwork can be.
So when we think about kind of breathwork and what it actually is doing to our bodies, we've really got to understand our nervous system. And so within our autonomic nervous system, we've got two branches. We've got our sympathetic nervous system, which is often referred to that kind of fight or flight part of our nervous system, but also the parasympathetic nervous system, which we sometimes refer to as the rest and digest part of our nervous system. And when we experience, I guess, traumatic events or kind of prolonged stresses in our life, often that sympathetic branch of the nervous system can be activated and it can stay activated. And if we stay in that kind of activated state, we can experience so many different challenges in our life. We can experience kind of that increased heart rate, maybe when we don't feel like there's a threat actually around us. We can feel nauseous. We can feel fatigued.
Even I think a lot of women experience a loss of a period. That's something I'm obviously not a psychologist, but I think that when you hold stress in your body, like as a woman, you kind of hold. You can't let go in terms of a period.
Yeah, and I'm not a medical practitioner. I don't really have the experience, the knowledge specifically around kind of what goes on in our body and when we do lose our period, what happens. But I can definitely understand holding on to that stress. And if our body's in that state of fight or flight, our body is not preparing us to have a baby,
of course,
to bear a child. It's literally trying to help us survive. And in doing that, it puts us in this state of always being on guard, always being ready for threats. And if we think about what that state is like for us, when that cortisol is constantly increased, we can report feeling so fatigued. We can report feeling flat, sometimes really anxious, really jumpy. And they are a lot of the common symptoms that people report from PTSD and other trauma-related conditions. But if we think of the role of breathwork and the role of meditation in that process, we also then have to think about the other branch of the nervous system, that parasympathetic branch, the rest and digest branch. So breathwork and meditation directly influences our nervous system. So it helps us shift kind of from our body from that fight or flight state to that parasympathetic state. And the science behind it shows that slow, deep and intentional breathing stimulates the vagus nerve, and that's part of the parasympathetic nervous system. And the research shows that when the vagus nerve is activated and stimulated, it helps reduce kind of our heart rate. It reduces our blood pressure, also calms stress hormones like cortisol as well. And when we think about the brain and what it undergoes through the process of meditation, engaging in breath work, imaging studies have actually shown reduced activity in the amygdala. So that's the part of our brain that's responsible kind of for our memories and our responses to fear. And it also shows that we can strengthen the prefrontal cortex during states of meditation. So that helps with our ability to kind of regulate our emotions, kind of is involved in rational thinking.
So just to summarize, so if you're dealing with, say, trauma and stress, you're in this state of fight or flight. And a way to kind of rectify that is to go into your rest and your digest, which is your parasympathetic nervous system. So breathwork and meditation are natural modalities to kind of switch. And what I've noticed in my own practice is sometimes I don't know what the stress or the trauma is exactly. But when I practice a breathwork session, I'll burst into tears or I'll feel tingles. And that's actually feels like a release. You don't need to know exactly what you're releasing. So my question is, do these modalities have a similar effect to what you're saying psilocybin does on the body?
To some extent, if we think about trauma processing work, a lot of the work involved, like a lot of the work that I do with patients who have undergone trauma or maybe like prolonged significant life events, is when our body is in that state of kind of sympathetic activation, we often don't feel safe within our own bodies. And so it's developing that sense of safety within ourselves, feeling like we can trust our bodies. When our threat detection system has been on for so long, it's activated no matter what. No matter what the threat is in the environment. It doesn't know the difference between a smoke alarm going off for a fire or a smoke alarm going off for some burnt toast in the kitchen. It's always ready to go. And so what breath work and meditation helps do is regulate our nervous system and kind of allows us to get to a state where we then can go process that trauma. And sometimes that can be a really long process for some people. If we've been in that sympathetic state for such a long time, our body has tried to survive for so long. And it's incredible that our bodies have these systems in place. It literally helps us survive. But what I say to a lot of clients is it's incredible that our body has allowed us to survive and get us to this point, but we also want to be able to thrive. And that survival state is not thinking about how we can thrive.
So does psilocybin kind of fast track this, I guess, for these people who are in such, I guess, traumatic states?
Yeah, a lot of the research then shows that that kind of processing work can be fast-tracked in psilocybin-assisted therapy, and often with just a single dose of the administration. So a lot of the clinical trials that are really grounded in this research and the effectiveness of it is people take a single dose of psilocybin and they see substantial changes that have continued 4.5 years after the treatment.
Wow. So what I'm thinking about is for a long time, cannabis was illegal. And slowly we've seen it be used in not just recreational, but being used for patients for pain, dealing with trauma, dealing with stress. Do you think we're going to see a similar timeline to psilocybin?
It's so hard to say because I feel like
Because obviously in LA and in the States, cannabis is legal and psilocybin is quite commonly used. Do you think that there will be this kind of shift? Because, yeah, it's funny looking back 10 years ago, if you told me that people would be taking mushrooms for, to help, I would go, no, mushrooms are so dangerous. They're going to play on your brain. Do you know what I mean? And now I'm like, wait, this is so crazy and how you said MDMA has been like legally approved, what did you say, 2023?
yeah.
For certain things. Like, it's just quite wild. And I think for people who are quite traditional, and I've grown up in a very traditional home, I'm just like, whoa, this is crazy. So do you think that there is a chance?
I think it'll take time.
Yeah.
I think it's a shift in our cultural norms and perspectives and also generational norms as well.
Massively generational norms. Like, I think if my dad listens to this episode, which he probably won't, but if he did, he'd be like, absolutely not. You know what I mean? He's super old school, but I'm open to it because in a sense, I'm a big believer in you do need pharmaceutical drugs for some things, but at its core, psilocybin is a bit more of a natural route.
And what it really comes down to when we're looking at, I guess, the impact of existential distress when we are near the end of our life, it's about finding compassionate approaches for that end of life care and giving patients all the options that are available so that they can experience the end of their life in the way that they want to experience it. That's why voluntary assisted dying was approved. We think about the principles of palliative care, and what Palliative Care Australia really kind of aims to allow patients to have is that autonomy over our decisions, that kind of sense of independence and the ability to make decisions about how we want to spend the last moments of our life.
Yeah.
And the fact that voluntary assisted dying is now a legal option that people can take, our kind of big argument and our ethical argument there is, if we can give people the option to end their own life, then why shouldn't they be given the option to access a treatment that might allow them to experience kind of that sense of independence again, kind of allow them to gain their personal identity back, maybe shift that perspective of not being so fearful of what the end of their life might be like, and allow them to be present with their friends and family.
Yeah, I feel like it's bringing back a lot of like the visuals and like the feelings of that really dark time for the family. And yeah, we would have really done anything to given mum one more little burst of just joy or one more little burst of connection to family instead of feeling like a vegetable. So yeah, I definitely think what you're doing is an incredible service. I want to ask you if you believe in this that idea that disease is dis-ease, because obviously you know a lot about stress and trauma.
When you asked me this question, I really had to think about it and really reflect on it, not just from, I guess, my therapy, like my experience as a psychologist, but also personally. And I think hearing the saying disease is disease really reflects the idea that when we don't have balance in our life, it can really present as kind of those physical ailments and physical illnesses, whether it is symptoms day to day or whether it does present as long-term chronic challenges that we experience. If we think about, again, this perspective from the nervous system, when we are chronically stressed, we might have a lot of emotional pain, we might constantly be feeling unsafe. The nervous system stays stuck in that state of high alert, that kind of sympathetic dominance. And over time, this activation can wear down the body's kind of natural ability to kind of regulate itself and heal itself. And that's where often you see people kind of presenting with a lot of fatigue. That's such a common thing that a lot of my clients that I work with report experiencing, is constantly feeling fatigued, and they've gone to GPs, they've gone to doctors, they've had blood tests and everything looks normal. And they don't know why they can get a full night's sleep but always feel so exhausted. And that's because the body's in such a state of high alert, always prepared to kind of fight when it needs to, because it feels like there's such a threat in our environment. And so it's always ready to go. And if we're always on guard and always ready, of course we're going to feel tired. Of course we're going to feel exhausted. And we know that that long-term stress can lead to so many changes in just our body's ability to kind of fight.
Yeah, I think it absolutely makes sense to me. When someone said that to me, that disease is dis-ease, I was like, mic drop. This makes sense. Because when you are just stressed and not in a calm state, you're running off adrenaline. And then, when you stop for the first time and you get sick.
Oh my gosh, that is the story of my life.
It's the story of my life. Every time I travel, this happens to me. And this year, I'm making a really conscious effort to not be in that state, because I always miss like a week of my trip. And yeah, it's not fair to myself. It's also not fair to Tom. When we go away, last year we went to Italy, the whole first week I was zonked out of action. And yeah, I'm just really putting in principles now to not be running off my adrenals, because I think as a society it's become the norm, but it will catch up on you. That is something I can confirm. So yeah, doing breath work every week, meditation every day, those two tools have really helped me get into that parasympathetic nervous system. It's really helped. And that's why on the walk club, I don't want it to just be a walk. I'm really trying to do the 5 minutes of mindfulness, because it really changes your whole day, which changes your week, which changes your month, which changes your life. It really has a domino effect. I wanted to know, is there anything else you want to share about the initiative you're working on at the moment?
Yeah, so the initiative that I'm working on with such an incredible team of people is called the End Wise Initiative. And if you just Google End Wise Initiative, it will come up, and it's a lot of information about actually what this project is and what we're doing. But in submitting the application to the TGA, so it's a Therapeutic Goods Association. So the TGA are the ones that have the authority to kind of reschedule different drugs and different medicines. And so when the TGA kind of made their decision in 2023 to reschedule psilocybin, we shifted the mindset that psilocybin was a poison to now being a medicine. And so essentially what we're doing with the application for helping include existential distress towards the end of life is allowing patients to have that kind of autonomy of more compassionate approaches to end-of-life care. And so we've submitted this application, and the next part of the process is actually a public submission period where the public are actually open to kind of have their support, kind of have their say. And the public can be made up of healthcare professionals kind of in the field, but also people who have gone through lived experience, people that have maybe seen their loved ones experience existential distress, experience the kind of challenges and that loss of identity, maybe that loss of connection. And so this public submission period is actually open until the 21st of May. So if there's any listeners that are interested in a more compassionate approach to end-of-life care, would like to learn more about what this initiative is, like please visit the website, have a read, the full application's there. There's also an incredible support, a document of support from some really pivotal researchers and professionals in the field. If you would like to support this initiative, there is the option on the website to submit your support, and any support would be greatly appreciated.
Amazing. So I always end the pod with the same question. You have been so insightful. I would love to know what advice you would give to your younger self.
It's so interesting being asked this question because I listen to the podcast a lot, and I always heard you ask other guests, and I'd be like, I wonder what I would say to my younger self. And I never fully could answer the question. And I think really intentionally thinking about it, I would just tell her to be confident in who she is. I think a lot of my teenage years and early 20s, I just didn't know who I was. And I felt like I had to seek validation from other people. I needed that reassurance to feel confident in who I was. And I always had these kind of pressures, whether they're internal or external, there to kind of do more. And there was always that drive that I was never doing enough. And look, don't get me wrong, I still have that drive there where I feel like I've got to do more. But once I found kind of who I was and I felt content in, the person that I am, the people that I want to surround myself with, kind of my place in the world, the career that I want to have and my passions, life just felt a bit easier. It's still challenging from time to time. And of course, we never fully, completely understand ourselves. It's a journey that we evolve through as individual people. But just knowing who I am and just feeling content in that decision and not feeling like I had to put on a mask, and I could just be me, and I could be vulnerable, and I could surround myself with incredible people that I knew would, give me that love back that I wanted to give them. I don't know, life just, as I said, life just kind of felt a lot easier. Things fell into place. I still worked really hard for where I am today, but I was able to be proud of those achievements, and I felt like I did deserve them rather than, the perspective I might have had when I was, 18, 19, where I just didn't feel like I deserved this. I didn't do enough to get where I was. And so just feeling content in me. So I definitely tell her just to be confident in who you are.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest thing, and I see it with all the podcast guests, is when you live as your most authentic self, that is when you flow. That is when things start happening for you. If you're living in a state of comparison, not feeling good enough, self-doubt, you're going to always feel like this push and pull with life. And life should feel like a flowing river. You can move against the rocks. When life throws you shit, you move along it. And I just love that that's the advice you give to your younger self, because as someone in her 30s now, that is the advice I give to every listener and everyone I speak to. Just be you, because that is when really good stuff will happen. So thank you so much for coming on the pod today. Full circle moment.
Yes, incredible.
And yeah, that was a really special episode. I hope you guys listened to the end and didn't hear the word death and turn it off. We are here to empower you in all areas of life. And this is a topic I really, really wanted to address. So yeah, if you love this episode, make sure you put it on your story and tag SelfDom. And I will see you on the next episode.